All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the first TechSperts Cafe Wednesday event about regulatory compliance. These events will continue on Wednesdays based on our schedule. If you need access to our schedule, it is on our website, stcntech.com, and click on events and workshops. So today we're going to do an overview of regulatory compliance and why it's important for you, what it is, and how it impacts your organization. So we start with what is regulatory compliance and why is it important? Regulatory compliance is the practice of following the rules set by governments or other authorities. So you may think to yourself, okay, well, I know what the government is. What are other authorities and how does that impact my business? Other authorities could be governing bodies of your type of organization. So a good example of that is the finance industry. The finance industry is obviously to some degree regulated by the government, but there are also other organizations that govern finance in different areas of the country and different types of finance that can change the rules and guidelines that you have to live by within the finance industry. Healthcare, education, manufacturing, they all have different levels of compliance that they have to abide by in order to, say, get licensed, to get insurance, or any number of other pieces of or parts of running their business. So the things that are generally regulated or have compliance applied to them can include securing physical items, data, documenting processes, or other things that your industry has as standards that it needs to live by. So when we think about securing, there are a number of different facets that come into that realm. It can be passwords, right? So we really think about passwords right away. We think about security, we think about data, we think about multi-factor authentication, but physical security matters as well. Who has access? We'll talk about this a little bit later. Who has access to what and when and where and why? Why do they have access to it? Do they really need it? One piece that we help a number of organizations with that isn't necessarily readily evident all the time is physical security of data. They think, well, my data is encrypted. They told me it was. I've got passwords and multi-factor authentication. That's enough. If your server room that stores your data isn't locked and isn't access controlled, then how secure is your data? And are you compliant with the regulations of your industry? For example, when we think about security and data transit, it's one of the ideas that is thrown around is this idea, is it encrypted at rest and in transit? Well, we have to add to that not only when it's at rest is it encrypted, but when it's at rest, can someone walk in the room and take it? That is an important piece of regulatory compliance for many organizations, and that includes again, finance, healthcare. Those are important pieces of the puzzle for them. Every business that processes or holds data is required to adhere to some type of regulatory compliance. And when we think about data, we always think about computers and networks and things like that. But you also, this is going back to physical security, you also have to think about file cabinets and files. STCN Tech is part of the Apple Consultants Network. One of the regulations we have to abide by is having locking file cabinets in locked spaces, and we do in our office. But if we did not have that, Apple would not have approved us to be part of their consultants network. So there are those little bitty pieces of compliance that folks often forget. Compliance helps to ensure that information is secure and safe when in the care of those who are charged with stewarding that information. So what does that really mean? That means that in your role within your organization, are you ultimately or even secondarily responsible for handling information? Handling information could be typing in addresses into a CRM. It could be scanning in transcripts from students. It could be processing those transcripts once they're scanned into the system. It could be processing, what do you call it? I can't think of the word. Processing statements, account statements, bank statements. All of that is information. And all of that information has got other information tied to it. So when we think about finance and we think about bank statements, the dollars and cents are what we immediately think of. How much money do I have in my checking account? How much do I have in my savings account? I need to get to that information. That's all very important. But what's also important is the secondary metadata that's tied to that. You can say that you have $15,000 in your checking account. That's great. But if someone gets in and sees your name attached to it and your address attached to it, your account number attached to those account balances, now they've got a more circular view of who you are, what you have, and where you are. That allows them to then act in different ways with that information. So those who are in charge of that information are charged with stewarding that information responsibly, making sure it's secured physically, logically, and in every way from soup to nuts all over and throughout the life of that information. And finally, it's important because the government says so else, notice the dollar sign. If you are not regulatory, if you are not within compliance with the regulations that the government hands down, there could be some pretty hefty fines involved. And if it's bad enough, they pull licenses, they shut you down. So regulatory compliance is extremely important. So big regulations, one of the ones that are out there that are really important to pay attention to right now. HIPAA never goes away, right? So HIPAA, what was that, in 1996, I think HIPAA became law. It is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And I gave this one 2 lines in my show because it established standards that protect certain health information that applies to entities such as healthcare providers. So there's a few things to take away from this. And we have an entire talk coming up in a week or two about HIPAA and regulatory compliance and how to stay compliant with HIPAA from a data and a security standpoint. But this is really important because if you are a healthcare professional, if you have a healthcare office, and if you process insurance information in any way, you must pay attention to HIPAA. You must be HIPAA compliant. And we touch on this a little bit later, from a cyber insurance standpoint, if you're not auditing it regularly, you're going to get hit with higher premiums and potentially have data control issues. So HIPAA largely applies to healthcare providers, but in the end, it applies to everyone who touches health insurance. And I know that you say, well, who besides healthcare providers touches health insurance? There are secondary organizations that process those things, and they count too. GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. This establishes standards for the protection and privacy of finance-related information. So we have HIPAA in healthcare and GLBA is in finance, but finance applies to just about every company that does business in any way. You are handling finance. You get a dollar, you're processing that dollar. That dollar is attached to customer data. So when it's attached to customer data, that dollar, it could be a vulnerability for you. So are you adhering to GLBA's standards for data and information protection and privacy? And just like HIPAA, we have a session coming up in a few weeks, all about GLBA, compliance, security, auditing, and so on. It's that important. If you take or process payments, you must communicate how you protect customer data and allow them to opt out of any data sharing, any information production that you do. That is probably the biggest takeaway on GLBA. And if you're in business, you take and process payments and you save information. GDPR, that's the new kid on the block. The General Data Protection Regulation that comes out of Europe. So a lot of people think, well, I mean, I'm not in Europe, who cares? Well, because it governs how companies should process and store personal data, anyone who processes, stores, and reports on data that has anything to do with anything that goes through the European Union. And that is a very vague general statement on purpose, because that is the truth. Almost every single American company does this. If you are an educational institution and you have any students from Europe, this matters. If you're a business and you sell to anyone who has an address in Europe, whether they live there full time or not, it matters. They have the rights to make sure that you are functioning within GDPR. And the short of it is similar to GLBA. It tells you how to steward your data, protect your data, make someone in your organization accountable for that data in ways that our American regulations don't necessarily do, and they don't do it in such an umbrella the way GDPR does. So now that the one regulation that I didn't touch on here is PCI compliance. That is another finance-related one, specifically around credit cards. We don't do an entire training on PCI or workshop on PCI, but it is out there. So how do we get started? I've talked about a few different ideas with relation to securing and protecting information, but the first thing you need to do is look at what you do and audit it. Your network security, your data storage, audit your physical security, audit who has access to what, why. Who has next evaluate the results based on the ideas of who has access to it, who needs access to it, why do they need access to it? And finally, how do we report and evaluate on that access, and how often do we do it? If you can't answer all of those questions about your data and all personally identifiable information that you have under your stewardship as a business owner, a manager, a supervisor, then you need someone to come in and help you get those answers. Finally, who is responsible for access, governance, and reporting? So access governance is who says who gets what. You have, so schools might have a board of trustees. They may have a board of advisors. They may have a cabinet, depending on the school. Finance companies will have a board of directors. There is a top level at which all of this stuff comes down from and is delegated to those underneath them to decide who should have access to what, where, and how, and ultimately report it back to that C-suite level group. But all of these questions need to be answered for you to get started, because these questions, they help you identify where your gaps are. If you can't pull a report of who has access to what, that is an important place to start. Because when data gets breached, the first question the authorities or your insurance company is going to ask is, okay, who has access to that? And then they're going to say why. And then they're going to say whose job is it to make sure that happens. Those are all very important pieces to the compliance puzzle. Why would you use an external professional to do an audit and help you mitigate anything that comes up? The first one I think is probably the most important one: objectivity. One of my favorite sayings when it comes to the way people will work with or work within their areas when it comes to reporting on those areas is we really have to pay attention. Is the fox watching the hen house here? Is the person reporting on the information 100% trustworthy to be fully objective and forthcoming with the information that is there? And when you have an external third-party professional auditing, whether it's your network, whether it's only your network, whether it's your data storage, whether it's your entire HIPAA compliance suite of pieces of your puzzle, the objectivity piece has to be there, or you may never achieve full compliance. Expertise. So Roger might be a great data operations manager, but that's Roger's job, is to manage data operations. Is his job to audit his operations too? Is that something he's done before? Is it something that Roger can be trusted to do, not because he's not honest and not because he's not objective, but because he doesn't know which stone to pick up and turn over to look underneath? A lot of times we think, well, the people who are doing the job are the best people suited to evaluate what that looks like. And sometimes that's true. When it comes to something as complex and detailed as regulatory compliance, you need someone who not only knows where the stones are, but you need someone who knows the government regulations on what size the stone can be, who's allowed to touch the stone, how smooth it's supposed to be, and where it's supposed to be stored. And a lot of times the internal folks in your organization are busy doing their jobs day to day. They're not necessarily the experts in the area of auditing. Auditing is a very important job to do, and expertise is their biggest weapon. Risk reduction. So external professionals, again, going back to the idea of objectivity and expertise, because they bring objectivity and expertise into the room, they're going to go through your risk register. If you have one, if you don't have one, build a risk register that will help you get a 360-degree view of all of the risks that exist in your organization, where you are in compliance with those risks, and how close are you to mitigating those risks. Risk reduction, risk mitigation are key components to running any organization that stores data, whether it's financial data, personal data, all of that data. And that is something that insurance providers are going to look at. Do you do this? Do you run a risk register in a way that allows you to see your risk? Every company has risk. Every organization has risk. It's there. No company has mitigated all the risk. No one has. But if you know what's there, if you know what your risks are, you make smart decisions to mitigate that risk and minimize your exposure to data leaks, to cyber intrusions, to physical intrusions into your workspace. Increased accuracy. So again, we're not talking about how good Roger is at his job, but what we are talking about is how many jobs Roger has. If Roger is managing your data operations center, how much time and effort does he have to put into writing that report, preparing the data, analyzing the data, and delivering the data? The increased accuracy you get from a third-party external provider is priceless, and you really need to apply it back to the risk register and be able to look at it from a top-down view objectively, so that you know where your real risk, real vulnerabilities, real windows are out to the world. Somebody made a really good analogy to me a couple of weeks ago when they asked me, hey, how secure is this? And I looked at it and I said, well, you've only given me this little box of information, so I can't really tell. I kind of need to see everything that's in the house. And they said, oh. They said, well, so if you only have this box of information and you can't see what else is out there, how can you tell what's there? And I said, you really can't, because I can tell you who can and cannot get in the window that goes into the room that this box is in. I cannot tell you who can get into the house with the windows somewhere else. There's always a window that is open on your network. There's always a window that is open in your data center. And when they open and close constantly, we have potential vulnerabilities. Well, those are hard to look at, to evaluate and report on if you're doing 100 other things. Your external auditors are not doing 100 other things. Alignment with organizational mission and objectives. This is something that we are very in tune with. The idea of aligning your technology security, your technology goals, your security posture with what your mission and objectives are. Organizations will create a plan. That plan includes who they are, what they do, and how they do it. It includes where they are now and where they're going to be later. Quite often, when it comes to technology, whether it's the computer on your desk or whether it's the data that you store, many organizations in the boardroom trust people underneath them to manage it and steward it and take care of it, but they don't necessarily think about it until it doesn't work. They don't think about it until it becomes an issue. Well, when it becomes an issue, it's already too late when it comes to a regulatory compliance standpoint. You want to keep it from becoming an issue. So aligning the way you do your information technology operations, from data transit to security to access to mobile workstations, kind of the whole 9 yards, aligning that with your mission and objectives helps you to stay compliant, because your technology is keeping up with the needs of your organization as defined by your organization. And if you stay in that lane, that is invaluable to you and to your organization from top down, bottom up, and it ensures that you stay as compliant as possible across the board. I want to thank you for coming today and for listening to me talk a little bit about the basics of getting started with regulatory compliance. We talked a little bit about what it was, some of the big regulations to keep your eye on. We talked about why it's important to do audits and why it's important to have someone help you with audits. The QR code on the screen will allow you to fill out our interest form if you would like to have a conversation about your data security, your regulatory compliance, any of those little pieces of the puzzle. That QR code helps you get in touch with us and start a conversation. If you are thinking about your regulatory compliance, if you're thinking about your cybersecurity insurance rates, now's a good time to reach out, have a meeting, and let's see where you are and help you get that best rate, get the best coverage, and secure your data in the best possible way. Again, thank you for coming, and I hope to hear from you soon.